we are not seeing any gap in upholding the rule of law. We are just seeing two operative systems of justice being dispensed. On one hand, they are extraditing, and on the other hand, they are upholding the rule of law through domestic trials.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So we're continuing down the path of universal jurisdiction.
So what do you have in store for us this month?
Well, after circling around Southeast Asia for Myanmar-related investigations last month, I was looking for universal jurisdiction as practiced in Africa. And as I was Googling, I'm still Googling rather than using AI, I came across Rwanda's positioning itself in relation to universal jurisdiction. I thought that was interesting to understand more.
So what are we talking about? We have the Rwandan genocide. The government estimates that up to 1 million, mainly Tutsi minority and moderate Hutus, died in 100 days. That led to the creation of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, established in Arusha, that you covered, as we have talked about in earlier episodes. But what then is the UJ? Because Arusha is not exactly Rwanda.
Yeah, Rwanda actually voted against the establishment of that tribunal at the United Nations. I mean, really, the authorities in Kigali, as far as I've interpreted it, have seen themselves as primarily responsible for providing justice. They've organised things like Gacaca, that's the local justice systems. But it was in a UN document I noticed that Rwanda is saying, particularly based on the Genocide Convention, the 1948 Genocide Convention that practically all states have signed up to, that every state is responsible for prosecutions to do with genocide and, of course, tracking and investigating, while they say Rwanda has primacy. That's backed up by some kind of emphasis on them cooperating internationally and what they call an active extradition diplomacy. So universal jurisdiction is kind of complementary for them. It's not a substitute for national prosecutions, but it is part of what they consider as important. So I thought that was interesting to explore.
Yeah, that sounds like a good thing to focus on. And we have some great experts in this field with us to talk about it today. We have John Bosco Siboyintore, the head of Rwanda's Genocide Fugitive Tracking Unit at the National Public Prosecution Authority, the GFTU. Hi, John Bosco.
Hi.
And we have Nicola Palmer from the University of Cape Town. Hi, Nicola.
Hi.
So let's kick off with you, Jean Bosco, as the definitive authority, I hope, on this. There are many universal jurisdictions involving Rwandans. We've looked at what's been going on in France and in Belgium as part of this series. We've had Rwanda mentioned there. Steph's, one of her main works is covering universal jurisdiction in the Netherlands, and we know that there are universal jurisdiction cases in the Netherlands. Is it possible for you to give us some kind of outline of the numbers? I mean, are there a lot of cases going on? How many are we talking about?
Thank you so much, Janet. And I think before we even go to numbers, we would like to bring the attention to our viewers and listeners that there was a genocide perpetrated against Tutsi in 1994 in Rwanda, where in 100 days, 1 million people were perpetrated. Genocide perpetrators had to run for their safety around the world. They were looking for safe havens. So it is on that note that it became first priority for Rwanda's justice system to pursue those genocide fugitives to be brought before courts of law, either by extradition to Rwanda or by using domestic trials in those respective countries where they have sought refuge. In so doing, there was an establishment of Genocide Fugitive Tracking Unit in 2007, later to become National Crimes Department. And in so doing, we have since then in 2007 around 1,120 cases, indictments have been issued in 33 countries.
So that's a really large number, John Bosco. What does that say about the cooperation or the way that Rwanda sees other countries stepping up?
Yeah, it's where I was moving to, because universal jurisdiction closes the escape routes of atrocity of perpetrators, especially of those international crimes. So universal jurisdiction prevented Europe from becoming safe haven. We have in that regard seen France, Belgium, Switzerland, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, Germany as well, making trials, domestic trials based on universal jurisdiction to hold those suspects of genocide perpetrated against Tutsi to book. And that sounds a lot. It sounds a lot that no one can, by crossing a border, can scot-free from being accountable for crimes committed. I see that as a very key component of universal jurisdiction in complementarity of domestic jurisdiction.
Let's focus a little bit on the Netherlands that I know. There's going to be a genocide trial, a big Rwanda genocide trial at the Hague District Court. What are your expectations for that? This is not the first we've seen. For a while, they were also sending people back to Rwanda, but now it seems to be that the Netherlands is doing that themselves. What do you think of the Dutch procedure so far?
Yes, before the upcoming trials that are expected in the few months to come, Netherlands have been one of the European countries that have used the universal jurisdiction to hold trials in their domestic jurisdiction. I can cite two cases, one of Joseph Pambara in 2010, and the one of Yvonne Hachowatabara of 2016. So this is not the first time that the Netherlands will be trying genocide cases.
And there's the other very big case coming up with a very high-ranking official of Bagossora's cabinet in the early 1990s, with the trial expected near next year. Is that somebody that was tracked down by cooperation with you and the Dutch police? How do you track these people down, and how do you cooperate with national authorities who have these universal jurisdiction cases?
We have been working with both the police and the prosecution very well to have the prior cases and even the others to come very well, so that they can pursue these cases in their domestic jurisdiction. But equally, we have been also working with them well in cases where they have extradited, because they have also extradited some cases, about 3 cases to Rwanda. So they are doing both. They are doing universal jurisdiction domestic trials, but as well as extraditing fugitives to be tried in Rwanda.
Can you just walk us through, though, Jean Bosco, when this starts? Is it that you have the information and you send it to the Dutch authorities and say to the police, please help? Or does somebody else in the Netherlands initiate it and then the Dutch come back to you and say, what can you tell us, John Bosco? How does it work?
Well, first of all, the global world has become a global village. So fugitives are on the run. And fugitives, they don't live in a separate world where they don't live in a world where victims cannot identify them. So we have many ways of tracking genocide fugitives. As we first of all mentioned, the Rwandan government established through the National Public Prosecution Authority a tracking fugitive which tracks these genocide fugitives. So equally, it is the task of the National Public Prosecution Authority to track those who perpetrated Tutsis through a genocide in 1994. So it could either way be that those fugitives commit crimes in the host countries, and all of a sudden, when they identify, they share the name, or we look into our database, we find that this person is in A or B countries. So it's a combination of many ways of tracking them. It could come from either the knowledge of our trackers who know. It could also be through sharing information because also universal jurisdiction entails even mutual legal assistance in international criminal cooperation. It also entails sharing information. So we work with the state or prosecution agencies, police to police, we do share information. So there are many ways of locating these genocide fugitives. So I'm not going to say that we get information from this or that, but we get it from a pool of information. So from that pool of information, we are able to bring or to identify that ex-fugitive is living in Y country, and we pursue those fugitives. We now directly work with the specific countries where we have identified a genocide fugitive.
And Nicola, to bring you in, you are looking at these universal jurisdiction cases. What kind of charges did the Rwandans who are in these cases abroad face? Are they actually connected to the genocide, which is now more than 30 years ago? And I imagine that brings a lot of issues with testimonies and witnesses, investigations on the ground, cooperation. What can you say about all these different aspects?
Thanks, Steph. It's wonderful to be joining this podcast. I think the really important thing when talking about universal jurisdiction concerning Rwandan cases is first to recognize that these cases are slightly different from perhaps the cases that you talked about when you were talking about Argentina or when you were focusing on Germany or France, indeed Timor-Leste and Philippines, because we're not talking about cases against foreign nationals that are happening in Kigali based on crimes happening elsewhere. Instead, what we're talking about when we talk about Rwanda's role in universal jurisdiction is we're talking about John Bosco's team working within the National Public Prosecuting Authority in Rwanda to track suspected genocide suspects in other jurisdictions. And so the outcome of that is this discussion about universal jurisdiction in relation to Rwanda takes us across a whole host of countries. So as Jean Bosco Siboyintore just said, there have been indictments issued in 33 countries. The work that I have been doing has been following the cases where actual cases have been initiated and there have been legal decisions that have followed from that. And there we're looking at 21 different jurisdictions. So what do we then say about what laws being applied? And the key thing that becomes visible when you look at the cases against Rwandan nationals is that we're not only looking at criminal law cases. This is not a classic universal jurisdiction discussion. Instead, when we look at these cases, we're seeing a whole host of domestic legislative moves. We're seeing a whole host of different legal forms that are being pursued. So we're seeing cases that relate to refugee status. We're seeing particularly revocation of refugee status or denial of asylum applications. We're also seeing prosecutions for immigration-related offenses, fraud and perjury in particular, alongside the more classic construction of domestic criminal trials for international crimes and then extraditions. So we're looking at a wide range of different forms of legal proceeding that become visible. And I think that this then asks us to think very carefully about what this means for universal jurisdiction trials generally. So let me stop there, but I think what we see at the heart of this is what becomes visible is that these are questions of immigration law and these are questions of universal jurisdiction trials.
The question that raises in my mind is this just because it's practical to put people on trial for lying on their forms or for overstaying their visas or whatever? And in fact, it's really quite difficult, as we all know, to prosecute somebody for genocide, because we all know what a high bar that is. So this is just a practical decision. Is that the case, Nicola?
I think some of it is about resources. So what we're seeing is a rise in universal jurisdiction cases. And this was implicit or at least mentioned in your discussions in relation to France, was mentioned in your discussions in relation to Germany. And of course, we could add the Netherlands there. But there's a resource question. It's not only a practical question. So European and North American states are increasingly willing to invest in these cases and support the Rwandan government's efforts to pursue these cases because they align with immigration and border control and the use of criminal law to secure state borders. And I think this raises really important challenges for questions of justice because It means that this pursuit of genocide suspects also intersects with what we're seeing as an increasingly exclusionary practice of the use of criminal law to exclude a large number of individuals that are getting, at least in part, legitimated by the exclusion of individuals who are suspected of involvement in the worst possible crimes, those of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
John Bosco, to kind of get on that point, in the Dutch cases that we know of for Rwanda, in several the Rwandan government argued for extradition, but The Hague refused and finally decided they couldn't be extradited. Why does Rwanda want that extradition? The Netherlands is one of the countries that tends to do actual kind of genocide trials and not immigration status cases. So what is the argument for asking for extradition, and how do you feel about the Dutch arguments for refusing this extradition?
First of all, the Dutch has extradited 3 cases in the past, and that lays a foundation of legal jurisprudence. So, for any reason they may bring up by not extraditing a case, it can be identified, can be discussed as a one-case analysis, not to generalize that the Dutch has rejected extradition. So, an extradition case is analyzed through a case at a go. So we don't really say the Dutch has completely rejected extraditing just because they have rejected one case. So they have just rejected one case, but they have extradited 3 on the other hand. So that clearly shows that they have not rejected, and where they have rejected, they have a reason. But in general terms, they have extradited because 3 cases extradited outweighs 1 which has been rejected, in my opinion.
Perhaps I could jump in here just to say that my understanding with the Dutch cases is that there were 2 extraditions and 1 deportation. John Bosco, please correct me if I'm wrong there. But I understood that, Steph, to pick up on your point, that we're seeing both domestic criminal trials for international crimes, so your classic universal jurisdiction case, and we're also seeing cases that are relating to refugee status in the Netherlands as well. So there's a concurrence of both of these things happening. And the resultant outcome is that one of those cases related to refugee status and asylum application, so therefore the result was deportation. The other 2 resulted in criminal prosecution for an international crime, and the outcome there was extradition. So it is important that we try to draw these distinctions. I understand from John Bosco's perspective within the National Public Prosecuting Authority that all of these provide mechanisms of accountability. I do think that they are doing different types of work for different communities. And I think, as you know, I sit as an academic in this situation, and I think it's part of our job to make clear what those different communities are and the different types of work and the different drivers for these trials.
Another thing I can add on, Nicole, is that Dutch extradited 3 cases. There is no mistake there. There are those 2 cases they extradited in 2016, and 2 years later they extradited another one. The other 3rd case you are talking of deportation is the 4th one, should be counted as the 4th one. And as you correctly said, we are not seeing a gap in accountability in as far as the Dutch justice system is concerned. We are not seeing any gap in upholding the rule of law. We are just seeing 2 operative systems of justice being dispensed. On one hand, they are extraditing, and on the other hand, they are upholding the rule of law through domestic trials, which is both welcome ideas in as far as pursuing justice for the victims of the 1994 genocide perpetrated against Tutsi. So, and equally, that is what entails in these international crimes. International crimes bounds every state not to babysit impunity, but uphold the rule of law. And we are seeing that being done. Of course, we would have much liked to have extradition or domestic trials in Rwanda where the crimes were committed, where the victims live, where there will be speedy trials, and where victims can go to the courtroom and hear the case, as opposed to case being prosecuted far away where the victims will not follow up the cases. But all in all, we are seeing justice being dispensed.
I just want to pull it again a little bit wider away from the Dutch cases, just because we've got you, Jean Bosco, and you are the head of the tracking unit. We're both conscious, Steph and I, being based in The Hague, that we've just seen what seems to be the very, very end of these United Nations international tribunals with the death of Lysian Kabuga in detention in The Hague. And this sense that basically everybody who was on the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and then the follow-up, the residual mechanism, everybody has been cleared off of that list. Can you just confirm for us that everybody that the UN was trying to get hold of is now gone, and then now it's only over to domestic prosecutions?
Yes, I think by the time ICTR was established in 1995 and trials beginning in 1996, they had a list of wanted high-profile cases, which were 93 in number. So they managed to try 75, and also 10 cases were referred to national jurisdictions, 8 to Rwanda, and 2 to France. Also, 3 cases were left to the mechanism to handle, of course, which included Kabuga, Protest Miranya, and also Bismana, who was the Minister of Defense. And all the 3 are now deceased. Out of 8 cases that were referred to Rwanda by the ICTR, we have 3, they have already been tried, the prosecution secured convictions, and they are now serving their sentences. But there was 5 more left on the list, and 4 were confirmed dead by the mechanism. And the one case, the case of Fulgence Kaisema, was apprehended and is now in South Africa. And that brings to the 93 altogether. So I can say we have now one case, which was a former ICTR target, which is now the case of Kaishema in South Africa, whom we could also request that they could refer this case for trial, because we have seen in Kabuga that delay of justice actually means denial of justice. And we actually hunted down and everywhere for 26 years for Kabuga, and he couldn't be seen. It was not until 2020 that he got arrested in France. But when he was paraded in the Hague court for trial, he became unfit to stand trial. And that was the end of the case. And what does that really mean to the victims of genocide who expected to see justice done? It's a devastation of, it's psychologically defeating. So we don't want to see a repeat of justice delayed, being denied in the case of Kaishema. We would humbly request that the jurisdiction or the South African government handle the case as a matter of urgency, because the mechanism have decided already that this case should be referred to Rwanda for trial. So any delay may actually not serve the purposes of justice.
I'm going to pivot a bit back to the universal jurisdiction cases and ask you, Nicola, you are looking at how also these are received. Do Rwandan diaspora communities see this as kind of a valid justice project, or is it also sometimes perceived as kind of the Rwandan government hunting people, trying to control opposition in some cases?
So the Rwandan diaspora view on this is varied and complex. So some Rwandan diaspora groups have been absolutely key in arguing for and pushing for these trials. So I think if we think about Dafonso Gautier and her husband Elaine in the Collective of Civil Plaintiffs for Rwanda, based in France, they have been part of pushing for the domestic prosecution of suspects in France for many, many years. And of course, now we're seeing some of those trials go forward. Frida Omohoza in Australia has also been pushing for cases against individual suspects there. And so there's no doubt that among some members of the diaspora community, there is a very strong drive for accountability and for an account, let's say, of what occurred in Rwanda in 1994. And for those individuals, these cases carry significance. Now, of course, the Rwandan diaspora is itself a very diverse community, and there have also been concerns that are raised in relation to these cases and whether they have been directed against individuals who are critical of the current Rwandan government, and also against individuals who themselves are organized in the armed opposition to the Rwandan government. And so if we look at the cases that are going forward, if we look at Germany, we've seen the 2 universal jurisdiction cases there against Rwandan nationals were actually brought against the former president and vice president of the FDLR, which is an armed opposition group that is explicitly in opposition to the current Rwandan government and based in the eastern DRC. And they were both found guilty of committing grave breaches of international law in the Eastern Congo in 2008 and 2009. In the US, there have been 16 cases. One of those cases was against Leopold Munyakazi, who was an academic who'd previously worked at the University of Rwanda and later at the University of Maryland, and had been publicly critical of the current Rwandan government. Munyakazi was deported to Rwanda in 2006, and this was a deportation based on the denial of his asylum claim, based on the persecutor bar, which is the equivalent of Article 1F in the Netherlands or in France. We could talk about that. But I think the Munyakazi case is interesting because he was actually acquitted by the Rwandan High Court's Chamber of International Crimes for the allegation of participation in the genocide, but was found guilty of negationism, of denial of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. And so we see a mixture of ways in which these cases are playing out. To pick up on John Bosco Siboyintore's comment in relation to South Africa, I'm sitting in Cape Town as we speak, and Fulgence Kayashema is in Pollsmoor Prison, which is just down the road from the University of Cape Town. And so in the South African case, we're seeing a case that's being brought against an individual who was initially indicted by the ICTR. His case was then transferred to Rwanda. And then in subsequent proceedings in South Africa, there was an indication that that case would go back to the UN mechanism. Rwanda is making a very clear case that he should be extradited from South Africa to Rwanda based on that ICTR indictment and the initial decision to transfer him to Rwanda. But there was a subsequent decision that said he would be transferred to the mechanism. Now, with the death of Felicien Kabuga, there's certainly a question of whether that is even feasible. But in the South African case, we have also seen cases relating to charges of international crimes that have been raised against the members of the RNC, the Rwandan National Congress, which is the predominantly Tutsi diaspora opposition group. And so I think what becomes visible, if we look closely at the Rwandan cases, is there are not nice, easy answers to universal jurisdiction that can make us all feel comfortable. These are complex conflicts that have much longer trajectories that didn't only begin and end in April 1994, and that this plays out in the types of cases that are going forward and the ways in which they are being adjudicated.
I understand some of the complexities that you're introducing here, but I'm wondering, you're saying this is connected to the complexity of the situations on the ground. Is it also connected to the complexity of how Rwanda is seen in the rest of the world? There are quite ambivalent feelings about how Rwanda operates. Some people have very strong views. They might condemn the genocide, but they don't particularly want to be seen to be cooperating with the authorities in Kigali. Is that also at play here?
So there has actually been very high level of cooperation with the Rwandan authorities in relation to these cases. So I think it's interesting to ask the question of how and why Rwanda has established these very strong cooperation agreements with, as we see, over 30 countries. But of course, if we look at the academic literature and we look at the general discussion on Rwanda, which I've been working in and on for many years, all of the post-genocide justice processes, the UNICTR, the Rwandan National Courts, the Gacaca courts, and now these transnational cases, all of them have been criticized for the extent to which they have been used to close down dissent and questioning inside the country. But they have also been deeply committed to and have also existed concurrently with demands for information about what happened to the victims of the genocide in 1994, information about who died, family members who were lost, and there has been a strong desire for accountability. And we've seen that through Rwanda really pursuing the most extensive form of accountability for large-scale violence. So it's the duality of these things, Janet, that I think it's just a reality of what it means to use law as one possible type of response to large-scale violence.
Just to add on, the 33 genocide fugitives that were tried outside Rwanda, particularly by France, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, all those countries, without Rwanda's cooperation, those cases would not have been tried in their domestic jurisdiction. Remember, the scene of crime and the witnesses and the victims, they are in Rwanda. And all those investigators, the police investigators, the prosecution, and the judges, they came to Rwanda and they were given smooth running cooperation. The government of Rwanda sent some witnesses to go in those courts to testify. So without the Rwanda's cooperation, I think those cases would not have secured the conviction they did. So that is something I wanted to chip in on the question whether Rwanda cooperates with those countries. They definitely do. And it is one of our duties to help them so that they can take their independent decisions. They verify the evidence. The prima facie evidence is verified by those police, prosecution, and the investigative judges in those respective countries. So whenever they examine the evidence and things they meet the evidential threshold, then they apply to court so that they can secure a conviction without the intervention of Rwanda. So what we do is just facilitating them to reach out with the witnesses they require. They choose their witnesses, both defense and prosecution witnesses. They are also facilitated to go to testify in those respective countries I have just mentioned.
Now, most of our audience will be aware of the huge effort that Rwanda itself also made to provide justice after the genocide. We have the Gacaca system, which is, a huge effort that operates at all these different levels for basic crimes. As I understand, people are judged in their own communities, but if it gets more complicated, involving murder or sexual violence, it went to court with professional judges. And now, Nicola, you have looked at these universal jurisdiction cases and the Gacaca system. I'm wondering how that compares. Do they have similar conviction rates? Do they have similar sentences?
So the sentencing is interesting. In relation to the ICTR, the median sentence was 25 years. In relation to the Gacaca courts, it was 19 years. And in relation to the domestic criminal trials in Rwanda, the median sentence was 14 years. This is looking across the sort of publicly available sentencing practices. So we're seeing quite a lot of consistency there. And we're seeing similar sorts of sentencing for the universal jurisdiction, the classic universal jurisdiction structure where individuals are being tried for the international crime of genocide. But we are also seeing similarly high sentences for when the prosecution is not in relation to a charge of genocide, but is in relation to immigration fraud. Now here, this is really only from the practice in the US. And here we're seeing sentences of up to 15 years for immigration fraud, where the charge is for perjury or for fraud in relation to what was disclosed about the individual's either participation in the genocide in 1994 or their association or connection to individuals who participated in it or their connection to organizations that participated in the genocide. And I suppose here I have a little bit more concern if we're trying to think of parity in relation to sentencing, because your guidelines for sentencing for immigration fraud would actually, general immigration fraud would be 0 to 6 months. And we're seeing sentences of up to 15 years or indeed some requests for up to 30-year sentences. So we are seeing some difference there. And I would have some concerns about how a prosecution for immigration fraud, when the underlying allegation is involvement in an international crime, is actually pushing up sentencing practices for immigration fraud generally. So Janet, you sort of alluded to, or you asked, is it just that it's easier to do this? I think it may be easier. It's certainly easier to do this. The evidentiary threshold is lower because what needs to be proved is that the individual lied on their immigration application, not to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they participated in the genocide. And so the case that I spoke about earlier in relation to Leopold Munyakazi is one of these instances where he was deported based on the allegation of involvement in the genocide, but nonetheless was found not guilty by a Rwandan court in relation to that charge, once the standard was beyond a reasonable doubt. So we are seeing some difference, and I think we inevitably see some difference once you're not talking about a single jurisdiction where the cases like in the Gacaca courts are happening with the community, with the individuals who themselves were present at the time, and where the focus is really on information about the bodies of the dead and who was accused. It's a very different picture when you're looking across this number of different countries, where there are a much wider set of drivers for why these cases are or are not going forward.
Jean Bosco, just to wind up, I'm wondering whether you're going to be out of a job reasonably soon. I mean, we're talking about a genocide that happened more than 30 years ago. A lot of people have already been tried. Many have died, as we've already discussed. So are you kind of looking forward to early retirement?
Yes, myself, I will retire, but the job will continue because we have many young prosecutors at the office who will pursue these genocide fugitives.
But where will they find them, Jean Bosco? I mean, they're all that you've got them all, or they're dead. Where are they?
No, they will just pursue for those who will be still living. They are not going to die all of a sudden together. They, of course.
How many are there still on your list then?
Oh, it is a big number. And of course, we are being challenged by the fact that they are also aging, they are dying, and the victims, the witnesses are losing memory. They are also dying. That is a challenge to international justice. And that's why whenever we get a chance like this, we appeal, whichever country or whoever can speed up these cases. We know we are running out of time, but again, that's our constant request is that can you use either universal jurisdiction and handle those cases, try them in your domestic jurisdiction, or extradite them to Rwanda so that they can face justice in the Rwandan domestic courts.
Jean Bosco, could you just confirm again how many exactly are there still on your list?
More than 1,000, because we have gotten both trials abroad and those who were brought back to Rwanda for trial. They are less than 100. They are actually 67. So if you regard that number from 1,120, the remainder is very huge.
John Bosco, could I ask a quick follow-up question there in relation to the Gacaca jurisdictions? So you had mentioned that some of the cases where there's been a Gacaca abstention, but the individual is out of the country, that your office may be following up on those cases. Is that the case?
Thank you, Nicola. As you were aware, because I know you know, Gacaca actually did us a lot of justice because close to 2 million trials were upheld. So there are those who were also tried in absentia. And some of them, it's because they had moved their address within Rwanda, or others could have moved across the borders. Out of those 1,000 indictments we have sent, include those who had evaded justice from Gacaca. So because those still tried cases, they in absentia also fall under our jurisdiction.
Thank you both for taking the time to explain this to us, what is going on with Rwanda and universal jurisdiction. We like to end the podcast with sometimes a slightly easier question, which is, what are you reading, watching, listening to? What would you recommend to our listeners? Do you want to start, John Bosco?
We are just requesting our listeners, the listeners of your podcast, to help by sharing information that in their next door, there could be a genocide fugitives living by. And I said earlier that what used to be a global world has become a global village. So sharing information with the technological advancement is no longer an issue. So we would like to ask cooperation from states where we have indicted. We would also request that stakeholders or even a non-government organization should also come in, because what happened in Rwanda, it was a genocide, though committed to Tutsi. It had an impact on all human mankind. So we saw this. We have seen that without international justice using universal jurisdiction, the Adolf Eichmann trial could not have succeeded. Said Hissène Habré trial, also Syrian cases, torture cases in Germany, and also seeing the Belgium, France, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway trying genocide fugitives. It gives other countries also to come on board and also try these genocide fugitives, irrespective of where the crimes were committed, because simply that's why it means universal jurisdiction comes in to complement domestic jurisdiction. So they should liaise with the Rwanda National Public Prosecution Office so that whoever seeks information, they should come to us and we will provide that information if that is going to help apprehend genocide fugitives who are still enjoying the safe havens.
I understand your appeal, and I'm sure our listeners will take it to heart. I'm going to press you on one thing. If our listeners want to understand what happened in Rwanda, is there one book or one documentary or one movie that you would recommend that you personally think gives the best sense of what happened?
The book, which has a lot of information on what happened in 1994, they can read They Live None to Tell the Story. That was the first book written in 1995, which entails every information pertaining to how Tutsis were targeted and killed because of their ethnic background. And that is what entails genocide. It entails they were targeted because of their ethnic belonging. So it is a good lead for scholars, students of law who want to understand. But they can also read the Akayezu case by the ICTR. There is that case tried in 1998. By the way, the doubting Thomases also who doubt that genocide was not committed, they should also read the judicial notes of 2006 in Karemera and others by the ICTR. There are those people who just insinuate that there was no genocide committed in Rwanda, and that has been crossed through that luring of.
Thank you very much for those recommendations. Now, Nicola, you've had a lot of time to think about what you were going to say on books, visual products, and or podcasts that you would recommend to our listeners. So have at it.
So, Steph and Janet, I have to confess that I had listened to some of your earlier podcasts, so I did know that this question was coming. While I endorse the recommendations from John Bosco, I won't take us to the literature on the genocide, but rather think about what I've been reading at the moment. And there are two books that I've been reading. The first is Antjie Krog's book, Bloods in a Rhyme. She's a South African poet who became internationally known because of her book, Country of My Skull, which was following the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Antjie's book, Bloods in a Rhyme, is about her relationship with her mother, who was very much part of Afrikaner nationalism. And it's a reckoning of her different political journey from that of her mother's in the wake of her mother's death. And so I would really recommend that to your listeners, along with Aruhati Roy's recent book, Mother Mary Comes to Me, which is also an biographical account of her relationship with her mother across the political battles that she has been involved in particularly environmental battles, and alongside the battle of what it means to be an author and what it means to write. And so I think reading these two books, one situated in South Africa and the other situated in India and deeply situated in those two sites, I think really speaks for me to how we need to wrestle with and engage with these complex relationships of our own histories and how our own histories relate to the countries that we're born in and come from and participate in.
Thank you so much, Nicola and John Bosco. I think this is going to end up as a long edit because we've explored so many different aspects here, agreed as always in comparison with an academic paper, only scratched the surface, but thank you very much for your contributions. Really appreciate it. And who knows when we'll get you back on again, when one of the next cases is, or when we really want to wrap up this whole series and think about, whether your universal jurisdiction is doing what it's meant to be doing. But I'm sure we'll speak again soon. So thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. We will link to all of these in the show notes so people can easily find them. But thank you very much for taking the time out of a busy day, I'm sure, to talk to us about this. It was very enlightening.
Just to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and you'd like to give us a bit of extra support, you can head over to our Support Us page where you can give us a tip, or you can follow us on Patreon and you can download our newsletter. And we really appreciate everybody who gives us a bit of extra support there.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast. Created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.